I'm standing on top of the fortress of Caribus in the Pyrenees Mountains in southern France. It's the last Cathar fortress. The Cathars were heretics, or deviants from the Orthodox Catholic faith. They were a kind of medieval hippie, dropouts who rejected Catholic doctrine and practice and embraced poverty, vegetarianism, and reincarnation. They flourished as part of the advanced culture of the south of France in the 1100s. Then in 1209, the Pope declared crusade against them, and the armies from the north of France descended. The Cathar Crusades lasted 20 years and virtually destroyed the high culture of southern France. At the siege of the city of Béziers, when the northern army was about to breach the walls and sack the town, a soldier asked his commander how the troops would be able to tell a Cathar from the many non-Cathars who also lived in the city. The commander famously replied, "Kill them all. God will know his own." After the troops came the Inquisition, a court of inquiry that had the power to root out apostasy, put heretics on trial, and turn them over to the political rulers for punishment, which included burning at the stake. Here in these Pyrenees fortresses, Cathars hid from the Catholic Inquisition until 1255, when the French king dispatched an army to put an end to them. The Cathars slipped away, however, probably to Spain or Italy, beyond the reach of the French crown. There's no doubt that the Pope considered the Cathar faith to be a threat to Catholicism. But the Knights of northern France had other, less doctrinal reasons for coming south with their armies. Ever since the time of Charlemagne, the south of France had been under the titular rule of the King of France. But there was much water under that bridge, and the rulers of southern France had little reason to pay much heed to their king's commands. After Charlemagne's death, his mighty empire, that included most of today's France, Belgium, Holland, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and Italy, was divided amongst his grandsons, and Europe slipped into a second dark age as the Vikings raided the coasts and rivers of Europe. Local rulers became self-reliant, building their own castles, raising their own armies, and defending their own people. This arrangement was called feudalism, and it left the King of France without much influence outside Paris and the area right around it, called the Île-de-France. In fact, some local rulers became far mightier than their king. Henry of Anjou, for instance, ruled most of western France and was also King of England. The Dukes of Aquitaine held sway over most of the south and were more closely tied to the Christian monarchs of Spain than they were of France. In 1137, Duke William X of Aquitaine married his daughter, Eleanor, to Louis VII, King of France, and the area temporarily passed into the king's realm. But Louis and Eleanor didn't get along. Eleanor had a well-publicized affair with one of Louis's knights, and worst of all, she was unable to give him a son and heir. In 1152, Louis divorced Eleanor, and in 1154, Eleanor married Henry of Anjou and England. The south of France thus passed once again out of the hands of the King of France and into the hands of the King of England. While Eleanor couldn't give Louis any sons, she gave Henry 5, including 2 future kings, Richard, called the Lionheart, and the less than stout-hearted John. By the time of Eleanor, things had become much more stable in Europe, especially in the south of France. Feudalism had brought safety and security to the countryside. The Vikings had been converted to Christianity and stopped their marauding, and new agricultural methods brought the people food and prosperity. Soon the towns and monasteries were flourishing with artists and craftsmen. This rebirth of culture in the 1100s is sometimes called the 12th century Renaissance. We see evidence of this rebirth in 2 places: in the beautiful Romanesque architecture of the churches, and in the courts of the French kings and nobles. In order to keep control of his lands, a king or nobleman could not settle in one place. Instead, he was always on the road, accompanied by his knights, ladies, and servants. The lords and knights were trained in the orders of chivalry, which meant that they knew how to arm themselves and fight on horseback. But chivalry also implied a code of polite behavior between knights, which required them to address each other in certain ways, to fight fairly, and to offer mercy in victory. Out of this society emerged the concept of l'amour courtois, or courtly love. Here in these medieval courts, the knights attempted to live a principle that had been taught by Plato 1500 years earlier. Plato believed that the most compelling form of beauty presented to humans in this life was the beauty of another human. He believed that a beautiful human face or body gave humans their best look at the divine that our fallen world had to offer. He acknowledged that humans could also be the object of lust, but that lust was a low, ignoble passion that needed to be overcome. The highest love, he taught, was love that did not objectify the beloved, that did not seek to possess, but that instead led to the contemplation of the spiritual rather than the physical. The proper response to human beauty was contemplation that led to a perception of higher truths. Today we call this ideal of a non-physical, spiritual love, Platonic love. It sounds a little naive to us, and it certainly can be difficult. Nevertheless, it has been one of the most influential ideas in history, and the arts are full of it. Indeed, it became, alongside the Catholic faith, one of the primary driving forces of the Middle Ages. Before the 1100s, a man might desire a woman, or even cherish her, but never before were women put on such a pedestal as they were now. As the troubadour Hugues de Saint-Cirq said, "To be in love is to stretch toward heaven through a woman." Soon a whole class of poet-composers sprung up, called troubadours, who specialized in songs about courtly love. Eleanor of Aquitaine was perhaps the most famous troubadour of all. Not only was she herself an eminent composer, but she was also the generous patron of troubadours, and her intelligence and beauty inspired numerous other troubadours. When she married Louis VII of France, she brought the troubadour tradition northward, and then when she married Henry of England, she transplanted it in his realms. Her son, Richard the Lionheart, was himself one of these poet-composers. In fact, right now, you're listening to one of his songs.